Dear friends, I have the pleasure to introduce our special guest, who doesn't need much of an introduction because he is well known around the world and in Europe, of course. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, I thank him for attending our conference because I believe it will be very inspiring and interesting for all of us to listen to his views on the future of economic development for Europe. This is what we are discussing all day long from early morning from a social democratic perspective, because we can see that Europe needs a change. And we have always been saying that. But what kind of change is the big question? And I can tell you that in all our developments in the last months, and I would say even years, we have always sustainable development as an approach in the core of our economic, social, environmental policies, because it really combines them all in many ways. And this is why I was very impressed some months ago when we were together with Professor Sachs at an event organized by the S&D group in the European Parliament. And he made such an inspiring speech about the role and the importance of sustainable development, and also saying one thing which we do not often recognize. He said, actually, the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been signed by a huge majority of the UN member states, are social democratic goals. And I think we should really promote that. And when we explain the substance of these policies, we should stress that this is our understanding about the future of Europe. So I'm looking forward with great interest towards your special contribution to our discussion exactly from this perspective. Thank you, Professor Sachs.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and honor for me to be here with you. And more than ever, we need each other across the Atlantic also. We have a real crazy person in the White House, a literal clinical case. So we have to take care of each other a little bit. We're doing everything we can to get sorted out on our side. So don't give up on us. But it's a time when we really need some allies and some clear thinking. I would say, as a starting point, that to my mind, social democracy is the most proved beneficial political ideology and political system in the world and in world history, I would say. If you look at who is achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, actually achieving them, actually balancing prosperity, fairness, and environmental sustainability, it's the countries ranked almost by who has had social democratic governance the longest. It's very simple. Now, unfortunately, the Social Democrats are not winning elections on that basis. And so there's one thing of having the legacy and having shaped really remarkable economic successes, and there's another thing about current politics. And there's obviously a big strain, and that also needs to be understood. But every year we make an SDG index, we being the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and every year it starts out, of course, with Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, and Austria and other countries with long social democratic governance and with institutions that are basically, I would say, social democratic in spirit, even if not in current politics, in the sense of universal access to all critical needs, dignity of all work, benefits, paid leave, family time, vacation time for all workers, no matter who, free healthcare or very low-cost healthcare, free higher education or very low-cost education, all financed socially with tax collections that are 40 to 50% of GDP, which pay for a decent society and which have proved against the principles of Anglo-Saxon economics that you can have high tax take and very high productive, efficient, cutting-edge, innovative economies at the same time. And that, of course, runs against all of the neoliberal and libertarian ethos that I have to live with every day in the United States, where we collect 31% of GDP in taxes, as opposed to Europe's 40+%. And imagine if Europe had to live with 10 percentage points of GDP less in taxes. You'd have a society that is dysfunctional. You'd have many poor people. You'd have a deeply ingrained poverty trap. You'd have huge inequalities of social mobility. You'd even have rising death rates among parts of the population. Well, the U.S. has all of that right now because we don't have social democracy. I live in the only country in the world that thinks that Ayn Rand is a philosopher, not a lousy novelist. The end result of that is a really, really dysfunctional society. So my starting point in talking with you is don't give up what you have. It actually works the best of anything in the whole world. Starting point. Okay, that's number one. Number two, Europe as a whole is not working very well, both institutionally and the different speeds of Europe and different levels of development and different nature of the European economy. Let me start with that point first. Europe's real problem is not social democracy doesn't work, but that Southern Europe and Eastern Europe don't work as well as Northern Europe. So if Europe were Scandinavia, Germany, Netherlands, you'd say, God, what more do you want from an economy? But, of course, Southern Europe is in crisis, and Eastern Europe is much poorer, and the power of convergence has been weaker than it might have been, except for the countries right on the border. So I was just in Bratislava a few weeks ago. Looks pretty damn good to me. Poland had its best 25 years. It didn't stop a right-wing government from being elected, but it had the best 25 years of development in Poland's hundreds of years of history, mind you. But Romania, Bulgaria, the Balkans, all more complicated. Different levels of development and convergence not really working so well. So that needs a diagnosis. To my mind, the diagnosis is not less social democracy, but actually more innovation and dynamism in those places that are lagging behind. Because why does Northern Europe work so brilliantly? It works brilliantly because it combines all of the social democratic institutions with very high rates of technological innovation and very sophisticated, innovative economies. And why does it do that? Partly because Sweden invests more than 4% of GDP in research and development, for example. And it gets a big prize out of that. It gets to be fair, balanced, high tax, and very technologically dynamic all at the same time. Finland, Norway, all living on technological innovation. I wish I could say the same thing about Central and Eastern Europe right now. but the amount of patenting is much, much lower. The university systems do not deliver right now a startup innovation environment in the same way that in Northern Europe has occurred. And I would say the same thing is certainly true about Greece, Spain, and Southern Italy. We know a big division from Northern Italy. So there's this question that I think is really important is how to make the parts of Europe that are not functioning like Northern Europe look more like Northern Europe, not less like Northern Europe. And the idea that this comes from market liberalization is not true. The big difference of Northern Europe and Central Europe or Northern Europe and Southern Europe is not which one is a more liberal economy. The big difference is who's doing more patenting, who's bringing new products to the market, where is industry and university working closely together, where are the higher rates of research and development taking place. The beauty of Europe, though, to my mind, is that any place you go, certainly in Poland, without question, throughout the Czech Republic, Slovakia, wonderful universities. This is not dealing with, you know, the universities came first from 1300, 1400. These are great established universities, great technological knowledge, or I should say brilliant people, great sophistication, but not an engine of innovation taking place right now. So my view is that the mistake of the discussion right now is that you don't make Southern Europe catch up to Northern Europe by making it look more like the United States. By tax cuts, by liberalization, by denying benefits, by other things. You make it look more like Northern Europe by focusing on technological innovation. And one of the reasons that I like the Sustainable Development Goals so much is that that gives an agenda. What should technological innovation be about? It should be about resilience of agriculture. It should be about low carbon energy. It should be about efficient materials use. It should be about circular economy. It should be about smart economy. And Europe, by proclivity and by technological base, should not cede the global leadership on these topics to China. It should say, this is our agenda. And it should use that agenda as industrial policy to make sure that not only is innovation being done, but the innovation is dynamic in Southern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, as well as in Northern Europe. So that's how I would view the most basic question of all, is that social democracy works. It produces the most balanced, livable societies in the world. It produces the highest life expectancies. It produces the lowest Gini coefficients of inequality. But it doesn't by itself produce jobs unless there is some technological dynamism attached to it. And there is in Northern Italy, but not in Southern Italy. There's none in Greece right now. The whole system has been broken. There's very little in Romania, Bulgaria, too little in parts of Poland. So that, to my mind, is the real agenda. And keeping the distinction clear that it's not liberalization per se, because Europe's enough of a market system. That's not the problem. The problem is competitiveness, having what to sell, new products, new dynamism, global competitiveness. And that requires being very sophisticated in technology. I think Europe needs more of a technology policy than it has also. It does not have enough European champions for global competition. There's no great IT company that is the rival of Google, Apple, Amazon, Huawei, Tencent, Alibaba. SAP is the closest, maybe Ericsson, but it's not really global scale competitiveness with the giants. And that also is a weakness from a security point of view, in my view, from Europe's security point of view, which is that Europe needs some champions. Like Airbus, well, it needs champions in information technology, in the large portals as well. And so I would think about an innovation policy, an R&D policy, a sustainable development-oriented policy, trying to get jobs created in the right way through R&D, innovation, competitiveness, not by the kind of naive view, which is counter to Europe's own record, that the way to do that is by breaking the social welfare system. That's not where the problem lies, because the social welfare system is working very well in the most successful economies of Europe. Of course, benefits have to be compatible in some sense with levels of productivity. That is undeniable. You don't want to go broke in the process. But it's not to change from the basic emphasis of a social democratic orientation. That's not the key. It raises another question. Why did the Social Democrats lose elections so much now? You're experts on that. I can only give you a guess, but I would guess that a lot of it really is about the immigration issues and the identity issues, not about the social democracy as a system issues. Because a lot of your right-wing populist parties are actually social democratic, but just for the nation, not for the immigrants. And so that's quite interesting as well. And I think it really is a big question from an electoral point of view. The attack of the left and the losing votes on the left, and it was true in the United States also, is largely about identity, migrants, anti-migrant sentiments, and so forth, and the question, and a kind of blame that we're not able to function now because migrants are taking our jobs. In the U.S., it's mostly about Hispanic migration. In Europe, it's mostly about Muslim migration and the Middle East and the refugee crisis and so on, and from Africa. So there's a big sense in both our regions of the other somehow invading, taking over, leaving us in peril, and so on. And I believe the left needs an answer to this that is more than we're nice people and they're not. I really do believe that for one simple reason, which is that there is no way that Europe or the United States could just open its doors, period, and say anyone that wants to come will come, because given the wealth of our two economies, 1 billion people would show up the next day if the door was really open. So there have to be limits, period. And then the question is not limits or not limits and nice or not nice. The question then is, what is the real policy? And I found in the U.S. Democratic Party incapable of defining a policy because anything sounded not nice. And I'd say the same thing more or less in Europe, which is that to not be hateful and xenophobic, the answer is don't be hateful and xenophobic, but that's not a policy that wins elections because it doesn't define what is the actual policy. And so I think that this is really part of the problem electorally, and that from my sense, it really needs to be sorted out. And the starting point of sorting it out for me are two things. One is to say, of course there need to be limits. Are you kidding? We're rich, they're poor. There are billions of poor people. Of course, we need a policy. The second thing that needs to be sorted out better, that I think was not sorted out, is where are the refugees coming from? And the answer is they're coming from American wars. And this was not said almost anywhere. So if you look at where the refugees are coming from, they're coming from Afghanistan, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Libya. What do they all have in common? The CIA. They all have in common U.S. wars that have destabilized all of those countries. Most of the time, the U.S. has done it on its own genius. Once in a while, France and the UK helped because they have a good tradition of this. And so it was kind of a reunion of the old imperialists and the new imperialists. But the truth is that Europe has paid a heavy price for US wars. But since we're allies, you can't say that. So you're left saying we don't have a refugee policy other than to abide by the Geneva Conventions, rather than saying stop these idiotic wars so that we don't have millions of people lining up to come here, which is the right political answer. It would have made a huge difference. Of course, one thing I need to be clear about, which is not pleasant, but it's clear in my mind. It's the following. Whether you like Bashar al-Assad or not, and I don't know how you could, there's a difference of not liking him and wanting to overthrow him. And to my mind, the U.S. had no right to sign on with Saudi Arabia to try to overthrow Assad in 2011. And that was now 6.5 years ago, and it's been a bloodbath and a disaster. And believe me, almost anything the CIA touches in regime change has been a disaster for the last half century. It's the most incompetent organization in the world in terms of overthrowing anyone. Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, disasters, complete, utter disasters. How does it get away with it? Secrecy. You're not supposed to talk about it in polite company. So it's complete unaccountability also. But the point I'm making is that Europe paid a very heavy price for this, because in around May 2011, at the Saudis' urging, the U.S. signed on to overthrow Assad. And lo and behold, 3 years later, Europe faced a massive refugee crisis that voted out of office the parties of the left. And that really created this populist backlash. And that's the U.S. doing. And it needs to be called out. Now we have really, unfortunately, a literally, clinically pathological person in the presidency. And I don't say that lightly, and it's not a political statement. It's meant as a clinical statement. And this is the opinion of leading psychiatrists and psychologists, and there's a new volume published a few days ago describing this man's clinical malignant narcissism and the threats that it poses to the world. So God knows what will happen now, except hopefully to keep him away from anything dangerous. And that's our main political task for the moment. But from Europe's point of view, you do need an answer to this question. And let me add one more thought then, and maybe if there's time for any comments or questions. Europe needs its own foreign policy, and I believe its own security policy. I think we're past the NATO era, myself. If I were you, I'd look at the U.S. as hopefully a friendly power, but not as your tight ally in everything. God knows exactly what's going to happen to us. We will do our best to get politically realigned and to survive this president. But Europe needs a foreign policy. And the crisis that Europe has gone through with the refugees exemplifies the failure of, or the problem of not having a foreign policy, because Europe was not able to speak with its own voice. And now, with Trump on the verge of decertifying Iran, Europe certainly needs its own foreign policy. And to say no, that's unacceptable. That's a danger for the world. It's complete violation of an agreement. Iran has complied with its agreement. It needs to be certified. This is obvious for everybody except one person. There's one crazy person. Even the team around him is trying to figure out, how do we handle this guy? So Europe needs to be able to speak clearly right now on these points. And also it needs an industrial policy consistent with that. It also needs an outreach policy that is consistent with this. One of the really striking facts of Europe that I'm sure you really appreciate, but for me, it's a kind of defining aspect of why this is so complicated right now. In 1950, Europe's population, if you take the big definition to the Urals, basically, or you include Russia, Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, Europe's population was around 700 million for broad Europe. And the population of Africa and the Middle East was about 350 million combined. So Europe's population was twice your big neighborhood. Now Europe's population is about 700 million, about the same. And the neighborhood population is now 1.5 billion. So Europe went from being twice the size of the neighborhood to half the size of the neighborhood. And that's where fundamentally the migration pressures come from, which is that you've got a big, big, big neighborhood. There are 1 billion people in Africa now, 1 billion in sub-Saharan Africa, 1.2 billion in all of Africa. And in 1950, there were only 180 million in sub-Saharan Africa. And in the Middle East, also a huge population increase. So this is a major phenomenon. Your neighborhood got more complicated. And Europe's population growth has been very low, basically near zero net, for the last 70 years, actually. So what does that mean? It means, first, more complicated, because if the neighborhood doesn't develop, Europe faces a crisis. If the neighborhood is at war, Europe faces much more of a crisis. And that's what's happened. And so Europe has a major interest in the success of Africa economically, in the success of the Middle East, and in the demographic transition in Africa as well. In sub-Saharan Africa, the population increased 5 times between 1950 and today, from 180 million to about 1 billion. If you look at the forward projections of the United Nations, Africa's population diminishes a little bit, and Europe's population diminishes, and Africa's population in the medium forecast is on a trajectory to reach 4 billion people by 2100. 4 billion. So instead of being 30% more than Europe, maybe it would be 6 times. That's the UN forecast. Why is it like that? Because the fertility rates in Africa remain about 5 per woman right now. Why? Because the girls can't afford to stay in school. Very straightforward. Because only 25% of high school girls are going to school. And when they do go to school, the fertility rate comes way down. They become literate, join the labor force, marry later, have fewer children, work in the cities, and the demographic transition's very fast. So my advice to Africa first and to Europe second is keep the kids in school. It's not so hard. That's why I'm late. I spent the whole morning and afternoon begging the EEAS and the Commission, spend some money on African education. The answer, it's very hard, Professor Sachs. Budgets are tight. It's not one of our listed priorities. I said, are you kidding? What is? So this is strategy. And it's really important. And I'm recommending one particular thing which I want to put on the table, and that is a special fund for secondary education for Africa that is a Africa AU-EU special fund so that all the kids can complete secondary education. I was told that members of the European Parliament don't like special funds. I said, why? They said, well, they don't like them. Anyway, I'm telling you, like them if you don't, because they're really important to get strategic objectives fulfilled. And what you need is strategy on this. And this could be a real breakthrough. So let me close in the following way. First, social democracy is the beating heart of decency on the planet. Honestly, it is the only decent political ideology that says from the get-go, we need economic development, we need it to be fair, and we need it to be green. So don't give up the principles. Second, as in the kind introduction, SDGs are social democratic goals. They're also sustainable development goals. They're really helpful. Europe should achieve them. The whole world should achieve them. They're not a gimmick, and they're not for Europe to help the world. They're for Europe to help itself first and foremost. Get youth unemployment down. Get investments in a renewable energy system for Europe, and all, boost R&D, which is SDG number 9. So these are good goals for Europe to embrace as organizing principles for Europe. Third, the secret to success is investment, not cuts. That's how you build the future, through investment. And public investment has a huge role to play. Fortunately, you're good at collecting taxes. Don't give that up. But invest it in R&D and technology, and when you do have your European-wide investment programs and your R&D programs, really give an extra boost to Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. And especially use the university system of Europe, which is about 1,000 years old, the leading university system of the world, the longest lasting of the world. Boost that, because that's the quality of thinking, knowledge, technology, insight for the future. And bring in a lot more of the Central and Eastern European universities as core participants in the cutting edge research and development, because that will stimulate the jobs in their countries. And then finally, look strategically and make partners with the neighborhood, with your own foreign policy. Europe's development aid should be focused almost entirely now on Africa. But to really help Africa make the breakthrough out of poverty, through the demographic transition, into quality education for all, and into a self-sustaining economy. This will be a huge favor for Africa and a huge favor for Europe as well. Because what you don't want is a demographic population boom and poverty bust. And that's the trajectory that will be more likely unless there's a massive forward-looking investment. Thank you very much.